Welcome everyone to this panel, which I'm really excited for, called The Religious and Philosophical Reflections on Peace. We have three really awesome papers. If I could ask everyone to quickly, all the presenters to quickly turn your videos on just so that people can see your faces really quick, that'd be awesome. Yeah, and then I won't take the time to introduce all of you, but feel free to begin your 15 minutes by introducing yourselves. And folks in the audience, if you have any questions throughout, feel free to just toss it in the Q&A or in the chat anytime throughout this. Any questions are welcome, and we'll try to get to them in the end. But yeah, and for those who are presenting, I will be keeping a 15-minute timer, and I'll send you a message at with 1 minute left, just so you know when to wrap up. So yeah, so without further ado, our first presenter is Mukadi Ilunga from Sophia University. And I'll let you introduce your own background as well as your own project for everyone. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. Actually, I'm Mukadi Ilunga, as it's written on the screen. I am a Jesuit seminarian and missionary to Japan since 5 years now. And I'm studying at Sophia University, Theology, of course. And I am interested in African studies, East Asian studies, all, Buddhism, Confucianism, Shintoism, and African religions, and how I can try to put in dialogue African thought and East Asian thought, especially in spirituality, anthropology, and philosophy. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, you can begin your presentation. We're going to take turns just introducing, we'll introduce ourselves whenever you present. So feel free to begin your paper for everyone, if you're ready.
Yeah, that means I can start already, right? Great, thank you. I will try maybe to start with my presentation, and maybe we can try to think together. This is let me share my screen, and I would like all of us to try to think together on this concept of Ubuntu. Ubuntu as a theory of social justice, reconciliation, and peace. First of all, I would like to invite all of us, try to just to have a look on this picture. I would like to invite all of us to have a look on this picture, to see our context, our society. We have a lot of issues, peace. We need peace, and we have war, we have weapons, we have all kind of social issues related to peace, justice, and equality. So in such context, how can we think, or what kind of justice we need to promote, and how can we understand justice, or how can we perform justice in such context of war and all kind of gender identities, race issues? The question is who first, because when we want to think about justice, is who is thinking about justice? First of all, the question is how can we address these challenges to achieve a peaceful and reconciled society? But because, before asking what, there is a kind of, preliminary question we need to answer to. The question is, who is thinking about peace and justice? Who is thinking about reconciliation? This is maybe my starting point for the starting point of my presentation. And in African philosophy, the human person, the human being, I am a Muntu. Muntu means human being, and Muntu is not, Kintu. Kintu means think. There is quite a difference between human being, and other beings, things, nature, and everything. So all beings, all beings, human beings, gods, animals, plants, and minerals are considered as a kind of continuum spiral of energy in which the role of the Ubuntu, not akin to, is to maintain and to strengthen the equilibrium, harmony among all beings. That means we are all interconnected. So the way we perceive ourselves, I think it's important when we want to think about the way of organizing our society. As a Ubuntu, as not as akin to, I am a Ubuntu not akin to. That means my role is to achieve this harmony and equilibrium among all beings. So let's try to to see what's characterize my identity, me who is thinking upon about justice, reconciliation. Ubuntu is what makes a human being human. What makes us to be in spite of all kind of racial issues, gender identity, war here and there in Ukraine, Iraq, or Libya. But what makes us human being is consciousness, relationality, and intelligence, wisdom. Then the mission of the Ubuntu is, to be harmony keeper, harmony with oneself, himself, herself, harmony with God, harmony with others, and harmony with nature. This is, kind of identity of who is thinking about justice, who is thinking, is reflecting on reconciliation and peace. So in African tradition or African philosophy, justice is, it's kind of a cosmic and social order, harmony with oneself, with God, and with the nature. This gives us kind of all kind of justice, kind of ecological justice, ecological, economical and social justice, anthropological justice, harmony. How we keep harmony in our relationship with oneself, with others, with God, and with nature. However, I think it's important to see, if in Africa we have the notion of justice as harmony, it's interesting to see how the West sees justice or perceives justice. In the West, the Western tradition, justice is more retributive justice. Since the rise of scholastic philosophy and under influence of Thomas Aquinas, the Western tradition's notion of justice is based on redistributive justice, retribution and punishment, sanction. We can see what happened actually with Russia, sanction. You need to punish. That is the way of, appreciating or understanding or perceiving justice in the West. Punishments, retribution, sanction. And this conception of justice is based on, the Descartes, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, because under Descartes' influence, being equal rationality. The capacity of rationality is the kind of ontological location of the being. Only, rationality gives meaning to the being. In contrast with their Western tradition of justice, in Africa or in African philosophy, the human being is perceived as a rational and relational people. Not only rational, but relational people. We are engaged in relation with others, with God, with nature, and with ourselves. Being equal rationality and relationality. Therefore, is not cogito ergo sum, but is, I think, therefore I am, but ego sum quia tu es, ergo cogitamus. That means I am because you are, and therefore we think. This is, kind of transformation in the way of perceiving justice in African tradition. A human being exists and think only because he or she is in relation, a relation through which he or she earns consciousness of her existence Radically speaking, the perception of my alter ego, or, perception of others, is my ontological location, the place where I discover my nature as a human being. Let's try to to say it in short. In Ubuntu, in Ubuntu philosophy, justice works alongside reconciliation. And because the central role of justice is not punishment or sanction. In Ubuntu philosophy, the role of justice is healing, of breaches, the redressment of imbalances in our relationship, the restoration of broken relationships, is seeking to rehabilitate both the victims and the perpetrator, who should be allowed to reintegrate it in the community he has injured by his offense. You can see the small Tutu, there is no future without forgiveness. So this gives us kind of idea of justice. We don't have only to punish, but we need to reinstore or to reintegrate both victims and perpetrators. This, that was the example of how, for instance, justice were performed in South Africa after the apartheid, to see how both victims and perpetrators were reintegrated in society. And that was kind of what we call the miracle of the South African miracle, because people of South Africa realized that they need to see all together, they need to look forward the future and the peaceful future, reconciled future. That means they have to face their own history with courage and enthusiasm, even, of course, doing truth on what happened during the apartheid period. However, they have to, both of them, they have victims and perpetrators. They have to be reintegrated in society. This is the way of, thinking peace building in society. So finally, Ubuntu philosophy informs us that to be is always to be with others, to share with others, to belong to the same humanity. As we shared humanity, justice, which brings peace and reconciliation, is not kind of redistributive justice as we see it in the West, punishments, retribution, but justice is kind of restorative justice, restorative one, a justice that restores the humanity of both victims and perpetrators. In short, I can summarize saying that in a culture of course, of war, of all kind of injustice, there is a way to approach our social realities, not only by focusing on punishments or retributions, but how we can address people, we can address issues by trying to reintegrate both victims and perpetrators in a society, because both belongs to the human family. And this is kind of approach we can have, kind of alternative to the Western point of view or the Western perception of justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll get to questions and answers for everyone in the end. Yeah, so for the sake of time, we can move on to our next presenter, who's Perdian Tumalan from Villanova University. Again, I'll let you introduce yourself and then feel free to begin your presentation after you introduce yourself.
Thank you, Flora. So thank you for the organizers of this conference and for the opportunity. And actually, Notre Dame is not really strange for me, since I finished my master's degree at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, just 20 minutes from South Bend. And I've been, I think, 3 times at Notre Dame for one summer peace building conference and also, I think, 2 conferences. So yeah, it's been a pleasure to finally come back again to Notre Dame. So my paper entitled "On the Importance of Aesthetic Theology for Nonviolent Theology." So friends, my personal experience with oppression has inspired this paper. The devastating physical and psychological trauma due to religious conflict in central Sulawesi, Indonesia from 1999 to 2000 that directly impacted my family and me has led me to, for some time, to reevaluate the notion of nonviolent stance. I had heard sermons and spiritual advice during that turbulent moment on forgiveness and non-retaliation that turned out to be banal and superficial instead of convincing. In this case, instead of showing forth the characters of Christian beauty, forgiveness and love for enemy became horrific religious performance under duress. Cheap consolations quickly cover up the gaping wounds of the victims from traumatic losses. Mourning was permissible, yet God's instruction of forgiveness must reign, since this might be the golden opportunity to bring the pagans to conversion and become Christians. The famous adages are, God will not let his children suffer beyond their strength, and that there must be a goodness behind every suffering that we must endure. Friends, far from providing true healing, this gimcrack aesthetic teaching about non-retaliation prolongs the victim's trauma due to the guilty feelings emerging from their inability to practice it faithfully. In this paper, I'm trying to show the importance of aesthetic theology to nonviolent theology and activism. I believe that aesthetic theology will help nonviolent theology and activism create a possible space for victims' voices and wounds, which often neglects in the construction of nonviolent theology. I will argue that nonviolent activism that becomes the inspiration for nonviolent theology has turned its focus on result-oriented. This orientation has made nonviolent resistance lose its integrity and oversimplify the history of liberation in many places. Moreover, it fails to provide space for victims' voices and focus more on the idealization and ideologization of their strategies. What is lost is the voice of the oppressed. Friends, for me, nonviolent resistance has long been hailed, and this is the fact, as the most influential political social change method. For example, Erica Chenoweth, a Harvard political scientist and a leading campaigner for nonviolent activism, claims that nonviolent resistance is relatively success compared to violent resistance. In her award-winning book from American Political Science Association in 2012, she argues by providing 3 initial stories about radical political change in 2 or 3 countries once ruled by dictators: Indonesia, my country, Philippines, and East Timor, that once also part of Indonesia, East Timor, until 1999. She further claims that based on her organization's study analyzing 323 violent and nonviolent resistance between 1900 to 2006, she says, I quote here, nonviolent resistance campaigns were nearly twice as likely to achieve full or partial success as their violent counterparts. However, this opinion is not without question, even repudiation. Newest study by Alexei Anisin in 2020 shows a different conclusion. He argues that during 19th and 20th centuries, the nonviolent resistance success rate was worse than had previously been thought by scholars, 48% compared to unarmed violent resistance, 61%. He explains that findings from a quantitative study, such as use in Chenoweth's, invited numerous critique from the sociological point of view, especially regarding the sample cases because they were confused with unarmed violent resistance. Another critique came from Anne de Jong, an expert in anthropology of conflict, who gives another interesting example of the problem within nonviolent direct political activism. In her research paper based on 19 months of ethnographic research in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, she meticulously reveals structural and symbolic violence that can be occurred and even sustained among nonviolent movements. Another voice, anarchist activist Peter Gelderlos, continues to disagree and opposes what nonviolent proponents claim as their success story. He even declares there is a pattern to the historical manipulation and whitewashing evident in every single victory claimed by nonviolent activists. Gelderlos' assessment on the incomplete historical claim made by nonviolent political activists or scholars made me rethink what Chenoweth claims as nonviolent victory, for example, in East Timor, that I mentioned earlier. I think Gelderlos is correct. Chenoweth oversimplifies the complex history of the painful struggle of the East Timor people. It disregards the contribution and sacrifice of many militant revolutionary groups, such as Revolutionary Front for an Independent East Timor, or FRETILIN, and East Timor National Liberation Armed Forces, or FALINTIN. Chenoweth's effort to distinguish violent resistance from armed struggle is based on a historical assumption, since the violent, non-violent movement that emerged lately cannot be separated from the historical trajectory of this militant resistance. What is even sadder, Sanoet's claim is solely based on one testimony of a member of a nonviolent group. So the popularity of nonviolent resistance cannot be denied and gendered a profound impact on theology too. Religious extremism and the rising of ethno-religious based violence after the world wars that culminated in the 9/11 attack have evoked new realization about the tremendous danger of religious conflict that cannot be separated from theology and scriptural understanding. Theologians and biblical scholars alike have been involved in various projects to find the basis for the theology of nonviolent resistance. Numerous theological conferences and books have been made to deal with the church's past violent history and violent passages inscribed in the Bible. Some even go further to conclude that Christian God is a nonviolent God. And here, friends, I'm thinking a Catholic writer and theologian like James Douglas as an example. He's hugely influenced by Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. In his book, Black Theology and Black Power, James Cone refuses to accept nonviolent resistance as the only way of liberation. While oppressors can hide behind, he says, sweet nonviolent language and dictate Black people to obey them while continuously creating and participating in their violent and unjust system. His refusal is not based, it's not because he prefers to arm or revolutionary resistance over nonviolent. In fact, he affirms his commitment to nonviolence in his other book, for sure, God of the Oppressed, with this statement. Thus, hatred and vengeance have no place in the struggle of freedom. Indeed, hatred is denial of freedom, a usurpation of the liberation struggle. However, friends, like Gelderlos, Cone's rejection to ideologize nonviolent resistance is because it will easily overlook the painful experience of the oppressed. For him, nonviolence can be manipulated by white people to perpetuate their oppression of the Black people. He argues, I quote here, however, the radical rejection of hatred and vengeance does not mean that we accept white people's analysis of violence and nonviolence. We are well aware that they derive their analysis of these terms from a theological and political interest and supports that status quo. For Cone, friends, a true nonviolent resistance must begin with what he calls as authentic ethics of liberation as the point of departure. This ethic of liberation itself can only be defined by, I quote here, the community of the oppressed. In other words, rather than starting the movement from idealized doctrinal convictions, nonviolent theology will only be authentic if it emerges from the painful experience of the oppressed in all its genuine expression without any attempt to tame it. Con explanations, friends, similar with what philosopher Judith Butler calls griefability. She explains griefability as follows: our opposition to violence affirms those lives as valuable. If they were to be lost as a result of violence, that loss would be registered as a loss only because those lives were affirmed as having a living value, and that in turn means we regard those lives as worthy of grief. Sadly, this is not the case with nonviolent theologians that we know. A quick look at the methodology of nonviolent theologians will tell us three primary resources for such theological constructive effort. For example, the Anabaptists, famously known as the Peace Church, primarily interpret Jesus as the nonviolent Messiah. Afterward, they will explain that the nonviolent Jesus is consistent with the scripture as the nonviolent revelation of God. This nonviolent stance also idolizes martyrdom as the highest calling among them Anabaptists, based on their suffering and persecution in the 16th century. It is also interesting to see the growing development in the Catholic Church that began to embrace nonviolent theology. However, unlike Anabaptists, Catholics begin with tradition and move to Jesus and scripture. Lisa Cahill and John Snigocki give two excellent examples of this effort. In his fine article, Snigocki investigates the long Catholic tradition and teaching regarding war and the emerging of just war thinking and critical thinking on war that began with Pope John XXIII and the Second Vatican Council, with the early Christian stance toward nonviolence and on the horizon. It culminated in Pope Francis' message for 2017 World Peace Day entitled "Nonviolence: A Style of Politics for Peace." Pope then directly anchored this nonviolent perspective to Jesus. He says, I quote here, "Jesus marked out the path of nonviolence. To be true followers of Jesus today includes embracing his teaching about nonviolence." Friends, Don't misunderstand me. I personally support nonviolent resistance in theology, for sure. I believe the kingdom of God is the kingdom of peace that encourages everyone to imagine a world where vengeance is over and radical justice will reign, Isaiah 11, verse 6 to 10. However, similar to Cone, it is hard for me to find my voice and relate my story and trauma as a victim of a violent event while engaging in a non-violent theological conversation. The conversation seems too perfect and too ideal, and that having a wave of burnt anger for injustice is not a Christ-like attitude. I personally resonate with Walter Wing, who encourages theologians to create space for the wounds of the victims and not to theologize from privileged position. He says, it is all very well for those of us who are used to receiving justice to surrender it voluntarily because we are normally treated fairly. But to us, the poor and the powerless, to acquiesce in injustice when that is all they have ever know is itself an act of complicity in injustice. Nevertheless, friends, my encounter with ecstatic theology has opened up a new possibility for furthering my engagement with nonviolent theology and finding my voice within the conversation. Ecstatic theology has helped provide a framework to bridge two worlds that seem impossible to converge. My commitment to nonviolent framework, resistance, and experience of oppression and injustice. Far from being a sweet wall entangled in capitalist commodification of beauty, friends, ecstatic theology begins its premise with the significance of experience and embodiment. Hans Urs von Balthasar, one of its pioneers in the field, critiques cosmological and anthropological approaches, two models of theology that eventually neglect the importance of embodiment. While these two approaches seem enthralling for many, even until now, for Balthasar, these approaches is problematic because it tries to fit Christ and Christianity into world philosophical contestation. The notion about supernatural and mystery become problematic since everything must be on the horizon of explainable and reasonable. And this is the problem. Once Christian truth is reduced to mere philosophical toil to prove Christ as the unified cosmological logos, and reason becomes the vital component of that effort, human being eventually comes in the first place as only the center of theological discourse. And finally, instead of Christ illuminating the definition of human being, modern theology, our theology, become reductionistic by putting Christology and God even under human subjectivity, primarily through reason. And for Balthasar, it is essential to know that God can only be truly understood not through philosophical explanation and logical coherency, but revelation. And in short, only God can reveal himself fully to humanity, known as the third way here, he says, by love and grace. And God's ultimate revelation in Jesus is through a form, a body, a human body. Another aesthetic theologian, Richard Philadesau, criticized also those perspectives by warning the greater emphasis on knowledge will lead theology into the trap of mastery, domination, and exploitation. For him, theology must be a discipline that not only searches for sophisticated logical coherences and integrity. Theology should be a practice to experience the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. In other words, the aim of theology is worship based on experience of a real encounter with the Holy Spirit and not only an intellectual exercise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, we're going to move on to our next presenter, Kane Rivers from the University of Waterloo. I'll again let you introduce yourself and then feel free to begin right after that.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. As stated, my name is Kane Rivers from the University of Waterloo in Canada. I predominantly study agonist thought, peace theory, and anti-fascist history. So I'm really happy to be here. This is my second conference. Yeah, now I'm going to start sharing my screen. Sorry, I'm just getting my timer up. Okay. Hello, everybody. This is an agonist toolkit for the radical peace theorist. Today, the objectives are that you gain a new understanding of this term agonism, and that we build new strategies as well as inspire new thought regarding agonist work, agonist peace theory, and this realm of thought. Now, a lot of you are probably wondering, as now I've used this word probably like 4 times, what is agonism? Agonism, it comes from the same root as agony, which is to describe the objective of democracy. It should be this hard and jagged process. It is the idea that conflict is good for society. This doesn't necessarily mean that all violence is good for society or that all these hardships, but in general, conflict is good for society. Over here, I have a small quote from Chantal Mouffe where it says, a well-functioning democracy calls for a vibrant clash of democratic political positions. Chantal Mouffe is one of the prime and premier thinkers behind agonist thought. It is still a new theory that has been around, I think, since the 90s. However, in the realm of theory and all these beautiful things, it's a pretty new philosophy. So I'm happy to be one of the new and up-and-coming theorists pushing this forward. Now, before I go into it, as I mentioned, conflict is healthy and good for society in an agonist lens, but it does not mean that all conflict or all violence is healthy. Now, there's a hard difference between antagonism and agonism. You might have heard of antagonism or an antagonist. This is a term for an unhealthy conflict, whereas an agonist conflict is healthy. The main difference is in agonism, it is this tit for tat relationship between friends or between adversaries, whereas antagonism is between enemies, and it is not healthy. It is not good for societal growth. So here I have 2 pictures. I'm a martial artist as well, so I let that seep into my writing and into my presentations. So first, in the top, we have David and Goliath, or a giant chasing a small man, whatever you want to see it as. And this is the quintessential view of an antagonist relationship. Agonism has mainly been applied to governance and to culture. So when we're talking about it, we give these examples. So an antagonist culture is one that stifles conflict for the sake of stability and longevity. So a good example of this is that a lot of people in our culture won't talk back to their parents or won't have arguments with their families out of sake of, well, it's the family, I don't want to get on anybody's feathers, I don't want to like step on anybody's toes or anything, so I'm just going to keep myself quiet. And then you hear all these stories of people just moving out, people just leaving, but all that does is it stuffs that conflict down further, and then it creates a big blowout later when it should have been a series of small, more manageable conflicts. Another example of this would be how we handle so-called freedom of speech, where we don't encourage people to challenge no matter the opinion. And of course, this does have its limits. We're not talking about fascism or these kind of thoughts because they are dangerous. But what we are talking about is things like racism, for example. If in an antagonist culture, what we do is we make these people feel embarrassed, and then they go inside and then they find their community online, where they might have started with just some like smaller biases, and then they are encouraged to do more violent acts, which then blows up instead of having the challenges on an interpersonal level. Now, in an agonist culture, you would encourage contestation. You would encourage people to be like, hey, I actually disagree with you, or I disagree with the professor on this in a public realm. And then you would engage in either a verbal debate or even sometimes physical debates, but it would not extend past the physical violence, and it would not build into this overarching systemic problem. Now, here are some assumptions that are inherent to agonism. And I want to go over these because later on in my presentation, I want to talk about the strategies that I would like to employ in this toolkit. But before I go over those strategies, it's really important for us to nail down these assumptions so that when you hear the strategies, you can be like, yes, this does fall in line with these, and that the critiques don't come from a place of like, well, that's not liberal peace theory and it's foreign, therefore it's wrong. So the first assumption is that conflict is progress. Conflict and progress, we don't necessarily mean that it's going to push us forward or it's necessarily the best or that it's easy, but that it is needed. So that means that we need to have these hard conversations in order to push our society forward. And quite frankly, that they're going to happen whether it is a small conversation between friends or a larger, more violent war or conflict between peoples. Second, you do not need to have a consensus in agonism. It's important to understand that, like, yes, there's going to be disagreements. That's a part of it, but we're not looking to please everyone. We're looking to have a jagged but healthy relationship where you are continuously pushing against each other to find some sort of middle ground. Then number three, hegemony of any kind ought to be freely contested. This means that any type of power should be opened to the contestation. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't exist. It just means that it should be open to the contestation and the pushback. Fourth, conflict is the sign of a flourishing democracy. If your society doesn't have conflict, and again, by conflict, I don't necessarily mean violence, but I mean just pushback, hard conversations, these sort of things and avenues for hard conversations, then it's not a flourishing democracy and it's a facade. Number five, violence is the product of a failure to communicate via other means. This is really important because it allows us, when we're thinking of resolutions, it allows us to understand that this violence wasn't necessarily like, oh, I hate you, I'm gonna punch you, but it's because you couldn't communicate or you didn't have the opportunity to communicate through peaceful means, or you have exasperated the peaceful means of communication. Therefore, you are left with no other option. Finally, resolution is more important than stability. I cannot stress this enough. There have been too often a peace process that valued stability over the actual resolution, which only erupted in further violence and further bloodshed. How does this apply to peace theory? A lot of people, whether you're watching this as a recording or you're just sitting here and listening, a lot of people, you're thinking, well, peace is the absence of violence, or peace, how can you involve conflict in your definition of peace? A lot of you will know or have studied Gauteng. We're specifically talking about a positive peace, where peace is an absence of inequality, not an absence of violence. Therefore, it's a process that will be ever going and never ending. Secondly, it comes from a place of a critique of liberal peace theory. Many of us, especially in my generation, are tired. That's a common theme, whether it is that we are working two jobs, you're in school, everybody's tired, and everybody's tired of status quo, and we need to try new things and new endeavors. Liberal peace theory, for those who don't know, has four hallmarks or four objectives. Firstly, reinforcing statehood. Secondly, creating a free market. Thirdly, creating stability and security. And fourthly, a so-called democratic governance. That it doesn't necessarily mean an actual democracy where people are fairly represented, but it usually takes the forms of ballots and secured polls, which only reinforces the state and does not look for true stability. At the end of this, there will be a list of bibliography that you can screenshot. This comes from Roger McGinty's work. Yeah. So before I get into my strategies, I'm going to go with some concepts and debates. First, the biggest objective of agonism is to elevate the local voices. This means that no matter what the people there are yearning for, those are the voices that should be elevated, regardless if they challenge international interests or Western hegemony. They are the ones that should be elevated. Secondly, the role of a third party is inherently different in an agonist peace process. In a liberal peace process, they're there to create stability, they're there to bring a halt to the violence, and they're there to put in people who will ensure this like greater so-called stability. What in an agonist mediator would do is they would be committed to neutrality from non-related countries. And this, when I say non-related, I mean non-related. I've seen a lot of peace processes where they use mediators from even just the region, even though they are neutral, they still have some sort of vested interest. Agonist peace process would implore people from far and wide to ensure that, well, there's no crossover. And finally, they have a vested interest in resolution, not in regional stability. All of these are kind of the same thing, but they manifest differently. Now, as I said, this is still a very new theory. So I've labeled some examples of what I call proto-agonism. So this would be things that would be labeled as an agonistic strategy, but were not called agonistic strategies in name when they started. First, the North Ireland peace process. They used local actors, and that was the biggest strategy that did a huge change in the framework and the culture of how they viewed each other. It wasn't the overarching ambassadors from the US, but it was when they started to use local churches, local sporting events to try and bring together the society to facilitate debates between Catholics and Protestants, or just facilitate a sense of camaraderie. And secondly, during the Colombian peace process, one of my favorite tactics that they used was not only a rehabilitation program for soldiers, but also a reintegration program where they were given jobs and they were given opportunities to turn over a new leaf and be involved in society after the Civil War had ended. Finally, the strategies, now that we have brought you all to the place of where agonism meets, the strategies that I would like to employ in this toolkit are firstly, utilizing local actors. Now by this, it's important to note that yes, local actors have been used before, but usually they're the ones who are either supported by bigger entities or support the Western hegemony or power structure or goals. This was seen in Israel when local grassroots actors were shunned, but bigger, but still local NGOs who fit better in the Western framework were highlighted, and yet none of their work was actually productive. So we would like to, or I would like to implore peace workers to look for actors in the unlikely places. Then I would like to build institutions for radical democracy to be housed. This means that building places where democracy can be lived to the fullest by all members of society. Thirdly, I would like to implore agonist peace workers to embrace the value of conflict, or embrace and value conflict, That means that you are not putting down the conflict, but you are allowing and understanding that, hey, this conflict needed to happen, and that it wasn't necessarily invalid, but we're moving past it now. And finally, transitioning antagonism to agonism. The perfect example of this would be the Colombian example, where they took soldiers who would have had an animus or animosity towards each other and then reintegrated them into society. So I just want to say thank you. And here is my bibliography. If you wanted to take a picture or a screenshot or look at it for later. Yeah, thank you for listening to my presentation. We all had a good time.
All right, thank you, everyone. That was really great. I really appreciate, first of all, like if there's any questions from any of you to each other, or from the audience to one person, or from the audience to everyone, yeah, feel free to either put them in the chat or like raise your hand. And then for even people who are in the audience that we can't see right now, there is a way for you to like appear on the screen and speak to everyone if that's something that you want. But if not, yeah, putting questions in the chat is also more than welcome. So I definitely encourage you all to yeah, ask any follow-up questions to each other. But I think just like from my perspective, hearing all of your papers, it's been really cool, like this like consistent theme that like all three of you are like pushing against some of the kind of like conventional presumptions about like violence and peace, whether we call it liberal peace theory or you know, the presumption that like nonviolence is either the only answer or the best answer, or the only answer that's worth listening to. So that's a really good like challenge to that presumption, as well as like in Mukadi's paper, like the challenging like our conventional notion of retributive justice. That was also really important. I think like as much as we in theory and peace studies tend to theorize different forms of justice beyond retribution, like when we look at the world and how it works, like a lot of the predominant forms of justice still like operates in terms of like punishment, sanctions, and retribution. So kind of thinking about like a different sense of relationality and of the human being, yeah, has been a really helpful contribution to this dialogue. Yeah. So I think one thing I also really appreciate about all of your presentations is just like your focus on whether it's your personal experiences or experiences from different communities, especially like non-Western, non-Euro-American communities, as like concrete examples of how they challenge some of our textbook or foreign policy textbook definitions of peace and violence. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess like one of my questions is if you want to expand a little bit further. I know oftentimes in academic presentations, there isn't a ton of room for talking about your own experiences, whether with actual, yeah, like violent protests as Perdion talked about, or as Kane talked about with martial arts as a really good metaphor for agonism, or Mukadi, I'm sure your personal experiences of being a missionary in Japan. So if any of you want to chime in on how these experiences kind of contributed to like your way of thinking, like that's my question to like any and all of you. Yeah. But in the meantime, continue with the questions in the chat or in the Q&A as well.
I can start, Flora. Yeah, so you're right. Time is always a problem with this kind of setting, right? I think one of the examples that really that's really profound for me is from Sean Copeland, a theologian at Boston College. I think her book Enfleshing Freedom is really, really profound, because the way she theologizing the violence toward a Black woman's body is through the experience of Black woman. So she doesn't start from like Jesus or tradition or dogma or whatever. I mean, with a conventional way to, you know, theologizing this nonviolent theology. But then she started from the real experience of Black woman. And also, I think one other example is Goizueta, also I think a theologian at Boston College. He pushes back the notion of heretics toward Latina Catholics at the border, Mexican border. And I think those two works are really, really profound and good example for us if we want to, I mean, going further to about how experience really influence the way we think about nonviolence.
Can I have some comment? Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to appreciate, to say thank you to all of you for your presentations. And I really get, I noted some really interesting insights. But fundamentally, I realize that all of us, we try to, what can I say, somehow to underline or to emphasize on one thing, that there is a need maybe to understand more, anthropology. We can talk about theology, whatever you want, we can talk about peace theory and everything, but there is a need to, to strengthen our way of understanding human being and his relation, with others, how we related to others, because conflict is matter of how we related to others. Other can be, nature, can be other people, or even to ourselves, And, I think, for instance, we have some people, like, if you want to go in theology, someone like Karl Rahner, his starting point is anthropology. How, even though he goes in phenomenology, with all the background with phenomenology, but his starting point is what he called transcendental, philosophy. It's basically kind of anthropological philosophy and theology, how we can understand human being. And in peace studies or peace theory or justice, I think there is a need to strengthen our anthropological tools and observations or capacity to analyze human interactions in terms to strengthen our way of understanding peace theory. It's the same, I think. For instance, violence is kind of a product of a failure to communicate in other ways. That's really interesting to see how, for instance, Pope Francis emphasized this issue in Fratelli Tutti. We are, of course, technology is going, is making a lot of evolutions, but as human being, we are becoming poor and poor in terms of communication. We have many, tools to communicate, but we become more and more poor because all the violence in the world is sign of, lack of communication or suitable communication. That was really interesting for me. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, both of you. Thank you for the really good additional resources that both of you offered. I do see a question coming in our chat, specifically for Perdian. But yeah, if anyone else has thoughts, feel free to jump in as well. But Perdian, I'll just put you on the spot. Would you speak on or even critique the Yoder or Hauerwasian peace theory in light of your own?
I love both of them. I have the books here, like John Howard Yoder, and also I just read this book from Hauerwas. And yeah, thank you, Thomas. And I think, of course, John Howard Yoder, really famous at my previous seminary at IMBS, right? Anabaptist Ministry Seminary. But then I think, and I also, I think I agree with him in terms of, because his book about the politics of Jesus trying to push back the idea about that before Constantine, Christians are really going toward non-violent stance, right? And no political things happen during the first three centuries of Christianity. But then for Yoder, no, that's not the case. Even in Jesus' time, even Jesus himself doing a kind of non-violent politics. And I think Howard was really good in explaining that in this book. But I think Flora and Thomas and Franz, my kind of not rejection, but critique to that perspective is still, it begins again from, this kind of ideal things in Christianity, like, for example, begin with Jesus. right? And how about people's sufferings today? How about those who are suffering now? How if we turn we flip the side and trying to think about those people first, and then trying to see how the Bible see those suffering instead of begin from Jesus and the Bible. I think that's my pushback to that idea. And I agree with Mukadi, and for sure. I mean, I like Rana. Thank you so much for mentioning that. Yes, and anthropology here is really important, because anthropology helps us to begin with the existence of human suffering, right? That's the case. Thank you, Thomas. Really good question.
Yeah. By the way, I don't know if I can add something to Thomas' questions. Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I think Truman. I think I emphasize something important and interesting. However, I have kind of difficulty to understand really. According to me, there is a need to rethink in the realm of Christianity. There is a need, if you want to take Christianity or Christology seriously, to go behind the dogmatic period. What I mean, most of theologians, especially after the Second Council of Vatican, or even alignments with German theologians in the beginning of the 20th centuries, they try to read fathers, the father of the church, and make kind of blank wall in Christian theology. That means we don't have a lot of information about Christianity or the evolution of Christianity before the church fathers, the apostolic church fathers. When we see the evolution of Christianity, especially during what they call the Maccabean period, because there is a need to see that Jesus came in a context. The context was Maccabean war, invaded by Greek people, and they were waiting for a Messiah. And Jesus, according to them, people, suffering, facing all kind of humiliation and all kind of sufferings. So waiting for a Messiah. And when Jesus, for instance, when we talk about nonviolence in Christianity, it's a really kind of topic we need to discuss more deeply, because we see some sign and presence of fight or kind of violence in Christianity, especially during the transition period. Even Jesus, the death or all the redemption of the humanity was through violence, because when Jesus was crucified, it's an extreme violence, actually. And violence, what the meaning we give to violence, that's all the questions, I think. But we need to go in the patristic theology, Christology, and pre-dogmatic theology, I think. Thank you.
I have a comment to what Father, can I call you Father Mukadi?
Just Mukadi, it's okay, I think.
Sorry. And I also have a question to Kane. I agree with you, Mukadi, because just a couple of days ago, I met with Father Alan Fitzgerald at Villanova. He's a very well-profound Augustinian theologian. And when I asked the same question, and he says to me, well, our resources is just so limited, right, about those 3 centuries. And anyway, if like those Christians in the first 3 centuries, they didn't engage with military, for example, it's not because the non-violent stance, it's more because of their theology. Because once you engage with military, it means that you worship the Caesar. So it's more about the lordship of Christ instead of this kind of. So that's just my one small comment to that. And I have a question for Kain. Thank you, Kain, for your really great presentations. I also read Santal Move back 3 years ago. I have a question about agonism and kind of your agreement. I know, of course, I agree with conflict as kind of tool to leverage our community in a good way. But then it makes me thinking about Judith Butler, because he says that, as he says that the problem with liberal peace is it stands toward individuality, right? So conflict here, of course, there are many good ways for conflict, but then the lens to see conflict is more in a instrumentalist, individualistic way. So my question is more, what is the imagination about community for agonism? Because I really like Mukadi presentation about Ubuntu and how I is you and you is me and so forth. So I just want to know about the imagination about interrelatedness, about interconnectedness.
There we go. Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And I think, so Chantal Mouffe in her newest, not newest, I don't know if it's her newest, this one. She actually talks about the us and them, and how this is actually, it's needed. And I think a lot of our culture has come to the point where we try to strive for, well, we're all connected, we're all part of this big happy family, and we all need to like just calm down and come together, which is a good sentiment. But agonism kind of goes against that and says, no, we are different, and that's important, and it's good that we're different. However, and we don't need to just come together as one and I don't want to say wash away our differences, but it's kind of a similar contrast as the melting pot versus the Canadian so-called salad bowl, where it's like, oh, in America, you wash away everything to be American, whereas in Canada, you're trying to be seen as your differences, even though in practice, this is not true, but like in theory, this is the thing that we're reaching at. So what it is talking about, though, is honoring those differences, allowing those differences to come into contest and to push up against the hegemony, and to be represented in fair and democratic ways. And so that's where the allowing for democratic institutions or radical democratic institutions to be built. What that means is allowing institutions that actually encourage public contestation and public challenging of certain cultural norms, whether that's like debates in youth or just having town hall meetings or more of those things. These are the things where we are honoring the us and them. We are honoring the differences between each culture and each political group and each ideology. However, we are not trying to supersede that and have this like interrelated, or at least the interrelatedness is different than how we would conceptualize it in our culture. If that makes sense.
Thank you, Kate. Really helpful. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for all the good questions in the chat as well. I'll definitely check these books out for sure. Mukadi, did you have a comment as well?
Yes. Thank you so much. I would like so much the presentation, especially what Kenny and really interesting insights, and yeah, I think I learned a lot from his presentation. But maybe there is a need to understand. I was emphasizing on anthropology, that there is a need to understand the starting point of each traditions. In the Western traditions, the starting point is kind of conflict. We have a very interesting insights or metaphysical thoughts with kind of Parmenides, in the ancient Greek, where the starting point of everything is conflict. And we try, in the Western tradition, they try to repeat all those metaphysics, which kind of become kind of a foundation of the Western thought. For instance, in the opposites, I don't know, maybe in the West, in the in the East, especially in the East Asia, China or Japan or Korea, the starting point is not conflict but harmony. Of course, harmony of the two, the yin and yang. Even though from the harmony as starting points of everything, or this harmony is kind of nothingness, all the philosophy of nothingness. And those starting point give us, kind of orientation to our way of thinking conflict or sociology or, peace building, something like that. That's maybe the kind of a challenge for us as new generation of scholars is how can we make in dialogue those traditions? Because we are sharing the same humanity. That means, and today we have people, who has, multiple identities, and there is a need maybe to to put in dialogue those traditions in terms to understand more and to have more insight in our way of perceiving social issues, especially peace and everything, or reconciliation. Thank you.
Great. Well, I don't have any further questions. So if open to any last rounds of comments, but if not, I'm more than happy to conclude this early so that everyone can go take a break before either you go to other panels or other things for today. Yeah, does anyone have any final thoughts or questions?
I just want to say thank you, Perlian, for bringing up Cone as a Christian who follows liberation theology. It was just amazing to I wasn't expecting that today, but thank you. I really appreciated it.
I very much echo that. Also a huge fan of James Cone. Definitely check out his books. Yeah, all of his books are good. The Cross and the Lynching Tree is probably the weirdest one out of all of them, but also somehow my favorite. So huge fan of all of that. Well, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining and for taking the time to make beautiful slides and present, for Dane for hosting this and running the logistics. Yeah. All right. I hope to see you all at other sessions as well. All right. Bye, everyone.
So thank you.